This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Shea, and I am your trainer for this afternoon. And I am really excited to be with you to present to you this incredible curriculum called The Growing Brain from Birth to 5 Years. I'm a certified trainer in the Growing Brain, and this wonderful curriculum was put together by the national organization 0 to 3. And I was trained in it 2 years ago, and it is really one of my favorite curriculums I think I've ever been a part of, because the brain is so fascinating. And as you will learn today and Friday, especially in the first 5 years of life. And you will learn about the amazing opportunity to help our children grow and develop in all areas of development. And so there's wonderful opportunity, but there is also vulnerability. So this is to really help you capitalize on the opportunity that you have to make our little kiddos the healthiest that they can be socially and emotionally and cognitively and physically and as a whole child. So I'm really happy to be with you. This is actually a 21-hour training, if you can believe that. And I have done that training over a Zoom twice now. But have no fear, I'm not keeping you captive for 21 hours here. I've condensed this into 6 hours. So I've taken what I think are the most critical elements to pay attention to about the brain, and then social and emotional development, which we will get into a little bit today, finish up on Friday, and then spend a lot of time talking about behavior, because I know that that's one of the things that preschool teachers and people, all of us as professionals working and parents working with children birth to 5, we see a lot of different kinds of behaviors, and sometimes those can be very, very challenging to parents and very challenging to the professionals that work with them. So I'm going to get started. We have a lot packed in here. We will take a 15-minute break at around 2:30. But please make sure that right now, get up and get something to drink if you don't have it there with you, something to snack on if you haven't had lunch yet, because I want you to be comfortable during this period of time. And I did recently read that people are suffering from dehydration as a result of being on so many Zoom meetings and not staying hydrated. So please make sure you get up and get something to drink if you don't have something to drink with you. And then I want you to be healthy and feel comfortable as much as we can in the 3 hours that we're going to be sitting and listening to the Zoom. So we're going to get started with just the basics. And I want you to just kind of think to yourself, and you can unmute, speak, and then remute again. We're going to think about how big the brain is at birth. So if you can just unmute and take a guess, do you believe the approximate weight of a baby's brain at birth is 1 pound, 2 pounds, or 3 pounds? So anybody want to take a guess?
2 pounds.
2 pounds. Okay, we had a brave soul that said 2 pounds.
1 pound.
1 pound. Okay, I have a 1
I say
pound.
3.
And now we have a 3 pound. Okay. Anybody else? 2? Okay. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you, brave souls, for volunteering those answers. So what we know is my slides are stuck and they won't go down. So that's a problem. Hold on. There we go. Sometimes you just have to keep playing with it. So what we know when a baby is born is that, in fact, a baby's brain weighs a little more than 3/4 of a pound, between 0.77 and 0.88 pounds. When we can see that the brain goes through an incredible amount of physical growth between the time a child is born and adulthood. And most of this growth in size and density takes place in early childhood In the first 3 months of life, the brain reaches more than half of the adult brain volume. It goes from about the weight of a grapefruit, a small piece of grapefruit, to about the size of a head of cauliflower in just those first 3 months. And by 1 year, a child's brain is about 2 pounds, nearly 2/3 its adult size. And by the time a child is 6 years old, the brain is almost full grown, weighing in at almost 3 pounds, or about 95% of the adult size. So does that mean that a nearly full-grown brain of a 6-year-old has 95% of the function of an adult? Well, of course not. Where we would not want your 6-year-old balancing your checkbook or babysitting for your 2-year-old. Size is just one way that a human brain grows. It's really about the connectivity of the brain, or the communication between the brain cells, that allows children to use their brains to their full capacity. And these connections are established through loving, positive experiences that young children have with their caregivers. But understanding the rapid pace of brain development in the early years of life helps to ground us in how important a role parents and professionals play in ensuring that their children are receiving the loving, positive experiences they need for healthy development. So we're going to learn about the different parts of the brain and their functions. And the first is we're going to talk about the nervous system. And as we talk about the different parts of the brain and their functions, it's important to remember that the brain functions via a neural network. In other words, there are no single brain areas that is the emotion center of the brain. Rather, there are many areas that influence our feelings. And as development unfolds, those networks become better connected and more intercoordinated. And likewise, there is no single memory center of the brain. There are many regions of the brain that affect how we store memories and then later retrieve them. With this development, the regions become interconnected and coordinated as what we call a network. In addition, over time, memory and emotional areas and many other brain regions become interconnected with each other, which helps to explain why emotional arousal can affect how we remember things. It is this interconnection of neural networks within the brain that helps to explain our very complex human emotions, thoughts, and behavior. And the brain is part of our nervous system. And the nervous system consists of our spinal cord, our brain, and a complex network of neurons that extend throughout the body. And the nervous system is responsible for sending and receiving and interpreting information from all parts of the body. It monitors and coordinates internal organ function and responds to changes in the external environment. And the nervous system is made up of two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is made up of the spinal cord and the brain. The spinal cord receives information from your skin, from your joints, and from your muscles. It also carries all the nerve impulses that control all of our movements. And it is through the spinal cord that our brains really receive information from our eyes, our ears, our nose, and our mouth, and the rest of our bodies. And then the brain uses this information to send out instructions to your body about how to react. It is really a very, very complex system that we often just take for granted. So based on the information provided by the senses, the brain decides whether to stimulate the body into immediate action in response to something that has just happened, or to calm it down and to go about our regular business of everyday tasks. For example, is it time to go to bed? Or do you hear a bump in the night and it's time to wake up and be alert? So your peripheral nervous system is made up of the nerve fibers that branch off from the spinal cord and extend to all parts of your body. And the autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system. It regulates automatic bodily functions such as your heart rate, your digestion, and your respiratory rate. And one part of it is autonomically activated when the brain senses stress, while the other is activated when we feel calm. And so prenatal brain development we're going to talk about next. And very early forms of the major regions of the brain, the optic vessel, the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, all become visible at 4 weeks following conception. And by 6 months after conception, ridges form that give the brain a bumpy appearance. The migration of cells that form these different brain regions is a very delicate process and is influenced by experiences, such as maternal substance use or exposure to toxins, as well as genetic differences that the child has inherited. In addition, nerve cell migration is also guided by the genetic blueprint that we share with all other people. We're going to go over just quickly the 3 major regions of the brain so that you have a better understanding of what parts of the brain are responsible and what they are really developed to do. So the brain is divided into 3 regions, as we said, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain, which are then divided up into even smaller regions. While the basic structure of the brain is present at birth, they are not fully mature or well connected. And when the brain grows, it grows from the bottom up and from the back to the front. So if you look at this picture of the brain is developing from the bottom up, from that brainstem and midbrain and hindbrain, all the way to the forebrain, to the top where your cortex is, and from the back to the very front. The hindbrain develops first, followed by the midbrain and forebrain, which is made largely of the cerebrum. And we will now explore some of the main regions of the hindbrain, of the brain, the hindbrain, and the forebrain, and smaller regions of the forebrain and what they do. So we have the hindbrain plus the midbrain equals the brainstem. The hindbrain is located at the base of the brain near the spine. It includes the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. I love to say that. It is intact and well developed at birth. The hindbrain is responsible for the basic functions of human life. It controls our breathing, our heart rhythm, and our blood sugar levels. The midbrain is located between the hindbrain and forebrain. Its functions include eye movement, hearing, motor control, sleep-wake patterns, alertness, and temperature regulation. The midbrain and hindbrain together are often called the brainstem. You can sort of think of the forebrain as resting on the brainstem. And then without the functions of the brainstem, which are necessary for daily living, it would be very difficult to function in our day-to-day environment. So it's a good thing that they are largely intact at birth. Now we're going to look at the forebrain. It is the forward or front part of the brain. It begins to visibly emerge at 5 weeks in utero. We're going to narrow our focus now to the part of the forebrain called the cerebrum. That's the largest part of the brain, which is responsible for higher order, more complex functions than our brain stem, including thinking, perceiving, planning, and processing language. Those are the skills we often talk about as executive functioning skills. And some of the most important areas of the cerebrum continue to develop into our mid-20s, and life experiences continue to shape the way it functions far into adulthood. And some are now believing that it just continues to grow and develop as for all of our life, based on the kind of experiences that we are continuing to have. So the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum. and it is part of the brain we hear a lot about when it comes to brain development. So think of the cerebrum as an orange. The cerebral cortex is the peel of the orange. The cerebral cortex is divided into 4 smaller regions called lobes. And those names are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And they are responsible for important functions of processing cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and sensory information. So the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex is located at the very top front of the brain. Remember how we discussed that the brain develops from the bottom to the top and the front to the back? This means that this is the last part of the brain to fully develop. In fact, this area of the brain experiences the most growth and thickness after birth through early adolescence, which is associated with the growth of cognitive abilities, such as thinking and planning and problem solving. All of those critical life skills that we need to grow into being healthy and socially and emotionally well-functioning adults. This area of the brain, other functions of the frontal lobe include starting and coordinating motor movement, higher order cognitive skills like thinking and planning and problem solving, all necessary for executive functioning, and for personality and emotional processing. The very front part of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex and is the last part of the brain to fully develop. It is widely considered the center of executive functions and is responsible for regulating thought, emotions, and actions. The relatively late development of the prefrontal cortex is one of the reasons adolescents are famous for their not always great decision-making skills. And if you've ever been a parent of an adolescent, you know exactly what it is I'm talking about. So how would the lack of a fully developed prefrontal cortex affect the behavior we see in young children? Are they able yet to exercise great impulse control through complex thought? Probably not. They need help thinking things through, help with planning, and help with problem solving. And that's why you are there, and you are the most important intervention in this child's life. So the parietal lobe includes sensory processing, such as knowing where your body is in space. And sensory processing is at work when a young toddler tries to avoid other children who are in her path to get the block off of the shelf. And as the parietal lobe develops over time, children are better able to orient their bodies in an increasingly efficient way. Picture a preschool versus a high school soccer game. The preschoolers chase the ball and run into each other, while the high schoolers seem to work effortlessly as a team around each other. Regulating attention is a part of the parietal lobe's functions, or how well a person is able to tune in and focus on a thought or action. As the parietal lobe develops, so does a child's ability to attend for longer periods. A young infant may be able to sustain attention, for example, to your showing him an interesting object for just a few seconds, while a preschooler can sustain attention for as much as 15 to 20 minutes when they are fully engaged in an activity. Language, or being able to learn and recall words to communicate at appropriate times, is another function of the parietal lobe. A person with damage to their parietal lobe might experience challenges in calling words to mind or having sometimes difficulty speaking at all. And then the occipital lobe, the function of that occipital lobe is to process visual information such as shapes and colors. When working with young children, we might notice a child who consistently incorrectly identifies colors. Their occipital lobe is processing visual information differently than the other children you might have in your room. And this condition is sometimes called color blindness. And then we have the temporal lobe, and that has a variety of important functions that include processing auditory information, such as hearing different pitches of sound, language recognition, understanding what words mean, storing visual memory, such as remembering a familiar face, short-term and long-term memory through a structure called the hippocampus, and emotional responses through a structure of the temporal lobe called the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for our fight, our flight, or our freeze response. And it helps us to interpret our environment as dangerous or safe. It is often referred to as the panic button in our body. So now we're going to talk a little bit about brain connectivity. And this is about how the nerve cells communicate with each other and make connections that form those networks that we talked about. In the beginning of today's unit, we talked about one important way the brain grows, and that's in size or volume. But the other way it grows is through the connections made within the brain between the nerve cells or neurons. How does this growth in brain connections take place? Well, we know that at the rate at which these connections are made is astounding. Scientists estimate that the brain is making around 1 million new neural connections per second in the first few years of life. And you can see an illustration of the network of the neurons on this slide. And I will show that to you. Neurons communicate or connect with one another by sending nerve impulses from one neuron to another neuron, forming long chains. And these chains eventually create complex networks. The more often the chain of neurons communicates or sends those impulses to each other, the stronger the chain becomes, making faster, stronger networks that pass information between areas of the brain. So think of it as like taking a walk in the woods. And the first time you make a path, you have to step over brush and rocks and branches in your way. And so you're going to be a lot more leery because you don't know what lies ahead. The path is very slow going and you want to be safe. But the more frequently you take the same path, the more familiar it becomes to you and the easier and quicker the trip becomes. The same thing is happening in a baby's brain as new neural networks are formed and fire impulses along this chain over and over again. So what does this mean exactly for us in working with young children? Well, it means the experiences that young children have in the world stimulate the neurons to communicate with each other, forming connections. So the experiences we provide young children are literally helping to develop their brains. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about how plastic the brain is in the early years. But we're going to learn a little bit more about brain cells and neurons and how they communicate with one another. So this is actually what a neuron looks like. And at one end of the neuron is a cell body with those hair-like extensions. And those hair-like extensions are called dendrites. And their job is to be available to bring in the signals called neurotransmitters from neighboring cells. And then once the dendrite receives the message from a neighboring cell, it triggers the cell body to create a nerve impulse, kind of like an electric current. This impulse travels down the long tail of the neuron called the axon to the other end of the neuron. And at the other end of the neuron are the axon terminals. The nerve impulse tells the axon terminals to release or not release little message packages, which are called neurotransmitters. neurotransmitters. And then to reach the next neuron, the neurotransmitters must cross a tiny, tiny space called the synapse. The neurotransmitters cross the synapse into the dendrites of the next nerve cell. And then the neurotransmitters that one neuron sends to the next neuron tell it to either pass the impulse or message along to the next cell or to stop right there. It really is nothing less than miraculous. So the impulse or message travels most smoothly down the axon from the cell body to the axon terminals when it is insulated by a fatty material called the myelin sheath. And the axon serves as the pathway. The myelin sheath keeps the impulses on the path so it doesn't escape, and also helps the signal to move faster. The more insulated the axon is by the myelin sheath, the more accurately and quickly the message is sent. So kind of think of it as like a newly paved highway, making travel quicker and more efficient, allowing messages to make their way speedily without hitting a bump or veering off course from one neuron to the next. A newly paved highway accomplishes this much better than traveling on a dirt road with potholes and covered with rocks. And this is where gray and white matter come in. Gray matter makes up most of the parts of the neuron, except for the myelin sheath. White matter is the myelin. It gets its name from fatty white cells it is made up of. And the growth of gray matter peaks in early childhood, while the white matter continues into adulthood. And the next thing we're going to learn about is what's called synaptogenesis. And that is the creation of connections between the neurons, or a synapse formation. Neurons that communicate with each other more often form stronger connections across their synapses. And all of this terminology can get, I know, rather complicated, and you'll probably never remember it again after today. But I really want you to understand how complex the brain is. And as I said, we often just kind of take it for granted that we have it, it works, it should work in everybody. And that's just not the case. And that is what attributes to a lot of the children's emotional and behavioral and cognitive responses. So neurons need to connect with other neurons to form a particular function, such as hearing or smelling. These connections can cross short distances in the brain or very long distances across the brain, or still longer distances from the brain down the spinal cord. A developing neuron responds to neurotransmitters and other signals in the environment, which help guide its path. The more often a child has a particular experience, the stronger those connections will be in her brain. And this is true of both positive and negative experiences. And remember, I talked about the first 5 years being both a period of opportunity and a period of vulnerability. For example, if an adult responds with eye contact and words when a baby coos, the connection in the brain that processes language is being strengthened. If a baby is shouted at every time she cries, the connections in her brain that process fear are strengthened, which means she is much more likely to expect to be shouted out and experience fear when she cries to communicate her needs. The experiences that children have affect the actual structure of their brain. In other words, brains are really built through experiences. And when you think about that as having the incredible responsibility that you have in working with these young children every single day, I want you to sometimes just stop and think to yourself, every single thing I do, and it is a huge responsibility, every single thing I do with this child during the course of the day is either going to make a positive connection and growth in her brain or a negative connection and non-growth in the brain or not healthy growth in the brain. So it's a lot to think about, but it's also wonderful to have that opportunity to be sort of the brain designer and connector for our little people, which will in turn help them to function for the rest of their lives. The next thing we're going to talk about is neuroplasticity. And I'm sure you probably have heard that the brain is more plastic in early childhood, and it doesn't mean it's plastic. It means it has the ability to modify itself and adapt to new experiences in the environment. It has the greatest plasticity at the beginning of life, and it decreases as we age. This also means that the child's environment in the first years of life has a very significant impact on how the brain develops and functions. And because, did somebody say something? We all good? Okay. Because infants are learning so much and establishing so many new connections. Can you all mute yourselves, please? Thank you. Because infants are learning so much and establishing so many new connections between neurons, they have a great deal of flexibility or neuroplasticity in their brains. But as we age, our brain doesn't make as many new connections. The plasticity of our brains is not as great as when it was when we were children. And this is the reason why it is so easy for little children to learn new things, like a new language, which is considerably more difficult for adults. The brain's development unfolds in what is called a hierarchical order. That means that the networks are forming in the brain region with the most critical functions for survival in the world, such as seeing and hearing, and then move on to more complex functions such as mathematics or complex problem solving. Remember, we talked about it, the brain develops and grows from the bottom to the top and the front to the back. It's like building a house. You start with the foundation and other critical infrastructure like wiring and plumbing and weight-bearing weights before painting and adding the decorative touches. Because of the plasticity of the brain in early childhood and the fact that children's experiences in the world shape their brains and how they develop, and the way we interact with children in our care is critically important. The quality and timing of the experiences we provide them can affect the structure of their brains for years and years to come. So we're going to learn a little bit more now about the timing of those experiences that influence the networks of neurons and their functions. So we generally have two types of neuroplasticity. There's the experience expectant and the experience dependent. So we're going to unpack those two terms a little bit. So the experience expectant neuroplasticity refers to connections being made in the brain that form based on exposure to experiences that most people or animals would have in their environment. So normal brain growth and development require exposure to these experiences, and the brain is expecting these types of experiences. For example, exposure to light through the eye is absolutely essential for developing vision. And experience-dependent neuroplasticity refers to changes in the brain's connections that happen only if the child receives the environmental stimuli to build those connections. The brain takes in these new experiences, which trigger new connections. And these experiences that some people may have, but not others. So for example, children living in an agricultural farm community develop awareness of weather patterns and the responses of animals in ways that children growing up in urban environments do not. Another example is that children growing up in harsh, abusive homes I can't tell if someone's trying to speak or not, but if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. Thank you. Just getting some interference there. And then the children, let's see, where did I go? Another experience-dependent neuroplasticity is what allows us to learn and adapt to our environment. Scientists used to think that experience-based neuroplasticity stopped after early childhood, but they now know that that is not true. And while the brain does become less plastic as we age, it does not stop. We can continue learning and adapting to our environment long into adulthood. So we all know that timing of when a person is exposed to certain environmental stimuli can absolutely affect the development of neural connections. Scientists have identified that some areas of development have windows of time that close more quickly, often called the critical periods, while other windows stay open longer, and these are called the sensitive periods. Critical periods have more distinct windows of time when they start and stop. After the time period ends, the window of opportunity for that skill to develop actually closes. And sensitive periods begin and end more gradually and represent the optimal time for maximum change. Although change can occur after the sensitive period ends, it just takes a lot more effort. And animal studies have shown that there are certain windows of time during which the young are especially sensitive to their environment and are expecting certain input. For instance, newborn mice must experience normal whisker sensation in the first few days of life, or they will fail to develop normal sensitivity to touch in their faces. And cats must be exposed to normal visual input during the first 3 months, or their vision will be permanently impaired. And we know from the experiments that were done by Harlow in the 60s that monkeys need consistent social contact during the first 6 months of life, or they will end up extremely disturbed. And then the critical periods and the sensitive periods, many of the same periods appear to hold for human development as animals, although we are less certain about their exact length. Babies require normal visual input, or they may suffer permanent impairment. Children born with a crossed or lazy eye will fail to develop sharp vision and depth perception if the problem is not promptly corrected. And language skills depend on verbal input or sign language for babies with hearing impairments in the first few years for the development of certain skills, particularly grammar and pronunciation. Without this input, language development may be permanently affected. The critical period for language learning begins around 5 years old and ends around puberty. This is why individuals who learn a new language after puberty almost always speak it with a foreign accent. And then we have the development of critical periods, and that is a part of normal brain function. Sensitive periods are the time in development when a brain region is most open to learning or refining a particular skill or brain function. Many new connections between neurons are formed during sensitive periods, and unneeded ones are actually eliminated. That is a process we call pruning, which we'll talk about very shortly. So different parts of the brain have different sensitive periods based on when those regions of the brain are developing and maturing. For example, early in life, the sensory regions of the brain have a burst of synaptic growth. And during the early months of life, sensory regions are being refined as a baby is flooded with new sensory experiences of every kind. Many new connections are forming between neurons in the sensory regions of the brain and the body. And remember that little baby, even though they might not yet be able to talk, they are taking in everything around them from all of their senses, and their little brains are working very hard at processing that information and trying to interpret what it means, and then to have an adaptive response to it. During the early months, sensory regions are being defined over and over and over again. And following the peak of synaptic development in the sensory regions of the brain, there is a period of great synaptic growth in the language regions of the brain. And following this period of language development is an even longer period for the development of higher cognitive functions, which extends well into the late years. Neuroscientists do not yet fully understand the biological basis of these critical and sensitive periods. One theory is that they correlate to periods of synaptic excess in the brain, and as described earlier, there is a staggering number of brain connections being made in the early years, about 1 million new connections per second. In fact, the brain actually overproduces connections. Some 50% more will be preserved into adulthood. In this sense, a baby's brain is more densely packed with neural connections than is the brain of an adult. But having lots of neural connections isn't the goal. In fact, too many connections can cause the brain to operate inefficiently. Rather, it is having the optimal number of connections to allow the brain to do what it needs to do for a child to function well in his environment. And this is why experience is so very important. During the critical and sensitive periods, a child's experiences, their sensory experiences, their motor experiences, their emotional experiences, their social experiences, and their intellectual experiences determine which of these synapses will be preserved, and the least useful or least used connections are then pruned or eliminated. So pruning, we've used that word before, and it is the process by which neural circuits are refined. And neural circuits and connections that fire more often or are used more often are retained, while those that are not used are removed. So pruning allows brain circuits to run more efficiently, and early experiences affect the nature and quality of the brain's developing architecture by determining which circuits are retained and which are pruned through the lack of use. And in this way, each child's brain becomes better tuned to meet the challenges of his or her particular environment. Overproduction of the synapses peaks in early childhood between ages 5 and 6 years old. Excess synapses are removed by pruning, which peaks in adolescence and continues into adulthood. And as you can see from the slide, during the early years of brain development, the foundation for the architecture of the brain is being laid. It is solidified through the early experiences we provide for very young children, which influences whether the brain's architecture will be strong or if it will be fragile. And this is why researchers believe that early childhood, particularly the first years of life, is a prime opportunity to positively influence the course of a person's life. Now we're going to just talk about a little bit about what providers can do, because you've learned a lot this morning about the brain, and it's been, it can be somewhat overwhelming to think about how complex the brain is, and our enormous responsibility in trying to help it grow and develop. So one of the things that providers can do is understand the parts of the brain and how they communicate with each other. But how do we apply this to young children? Well, one very important way we apply it is by setting realistic expectations for children in our care. For example, based on the timing of the development of the frontal lobe, we wouldn't expect a preschooler to have the kind of impulse control we'd expect to have a second grader. And knowing that infants have rudimentary brain functions for attention, we wouldn't expect babies or even young toddlers to have long attention spans. Another important way we apply it is by being keenly aware of the importance of our interaction with our children and the kinds of experiences we provide them. Because remember, we are helping to build the foundation of their brain architecture. They will build connections through these experiences with us that they will take with them forever and apply for the rest of their lives. We also know that positive relationships and supportive, enriching environments that provide just right challenges are those that are tailored to the child's developmental stage and encourage new skill development. They help children learn and grow. So in the following units, we're going to explore more deeply how positive early experiences with caregivers and providers like you can enhance the development of a healthy brain, maximizing a child's ability to develop strong language, strong cognitive skills, a healthy brain, and maximizing the child's ability to develop strong language and physical skills that set them up for success academically and socially into the future. And so let's just go over some key messages here before we get into social emotional development. So what we know is that the brain is not fully developed at birth. It grows in size and connectivity. The brain grows from the back to the front and the bottom up. The brainstem and the lower back of the brain develops first and is largely formed at birth, giving us the ability to go through everyday functions. And then also that the forebrain in the upper part of the brain is the last part of the brain to develop and is very plastic. It is shaped by experiences in early childhood and is responsible for higher order functioning such as thinking and planning and problem solving and sensory processing and emotional regulation and language development. All of those skills and qualities that we've talked about as being critically important to growing up healthy and strong physically and emotionally and socially. We as providers play a key role in providing children developmentally appropriate stimulation and responsive care to foster healthy brain growth in early childhood when the brain is most plastic. So we're just going to stop right here for a minute, and I would like just some responses to this point. Is there any questions that anyone might have? And what's your biggest takeaway that you've learned so far about the brain? If you can unmute yourself and just respond and then remute again, that would be great. What's been your biggest takeaway so far about the brain? Anybody?
Catherine, there is a question in the chat box asking, is the parietal lobe where ADHD and sensory issues are found?
Well, that is a great question. And actually what we believe is that there is no one part of the brain that's responsible for ADHD. It's a lot of the different parts of the brain combined. That is a part of motor, it's a part of sensory, and it's very complex, but that's an excellent question. ADHD actually involves all of the different parts of the brain. Great question, thank you. Anybody want to respond about what your biggest takeaway so far from this morning and learning about the brain? Was this new information for you, or reminders, or how might it make you think about children in your care differently?
Well, can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay, I think the biggest thing that I get from this is good news. Because when you have a child that you know has had trauma and has had a lot of adverse experiences, and it's, you know, those hardwired into the brain, these negative things. What we know is that you can't take away the negative things, but you can create new pathways that are positive, that can sort of overcome overcome and help a child with trauma. So the more positive experiences you're giving this child through when they're in the classroom, that, you know, opportunity for growth and success is there, because the brain, you know, will develop these new neural pathways, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's really, really critical information. Yes, indeed. There is opportunity. Lots of opportunity.
Right, every day.
Anyone else like to share?
This is Wendy. I just wanted to reiterate, thank you for presenting all this brain research. That's a real passion of mine, especially as it relates to the work that we all do here at Children First. So, I just want to drive home that point, that it's basically everything that you do and how you're interacting with children and how you're setting up your environment is directly wiring a child's brain. There is no other job, profession that really does that. It is a huge undertaking, and you all do tremendous work around this. And it's important to remember that everything that you do impacts how the child's brain is wired.
Yes, Wendy, thank you for that. And thank you for inviting me to provide this training today. I too am like a brain groupie. That's why I was so attracted to this curriculum. If you can mute yourself, if you can all mute yourselves, because we're getting some feedback, that would be great. Thank you. Yes, that's why I was so attracted to this. And as you said, the huge responsibility but opportunity. And when people ask you what you do, don't say I'm just a child care provider. Say I'm a brain maker. I'm a brain grower of early of babies and young children. And there's, as Wendy said, there's no greater profession on earth than the ones that we're involved in. And I want to do this work for as long as I live, and then probably come back and do it again. But yes, and if you remember the two key words, and you're going to keep hearing these two key words, it's relationships and experiences that really help that brain to grow. And the more positive the relationships are, and the more positive the experiences are and rich, the better that brain is going to grow. And the better that brain grows, the more functional individual is going to be. So yes, every time you look at them, just see that connectivity, like you saw in that one little slide, just see all those little cells and neurons connecting and growing. And it really does give you great joy. It gives me great joy anyway. And you all have such important roles to play for children. So thanks for that comment, Wendy. Anyone else want to make a comment or share what your biggest takeaway was today? All right, then we are going to continue and get into what is Unit 5 actually in the curriculum, and that is on social and emotional development and how it relates to the brain. How does the brain really Why is it and how is it connected to a child's social emotional development? Well, you're going to begin to find out today. We're going to start to talk about it, and then we'll finish up this part on Friday along with behavior and some talk about how critical play is in a child's life. So what is social emotional development? Well, it includes the child's experience, expression, and management of emotions, as well as the ability to establish positive and rewarding relationships. There's that word again, with others. It includes both intrapersonal and interpersonal processes, and that is how one feels about oneself and also in relation to others. So loving relationships provide young children a sense of comfort, of safety, of confidence, and encouragement. They teach young children how to form friendships, how to communicate emotions, and how to deal with challenges. Strong, positive relationships also help children develop trust and empathy, which is an important skill to have, and compassion and a sense of right and wrong, which is also very, very important. So beginning at birth, young children rapidly develop their abilities to experience and express different emotions, as well as their capacity to cope with and to manage a variety of feelings. Developing social emotional skills allows children to learn from others, develop friendships and relationships with others, and express feelings and emotions in an appropriate manner. And the development of these skills unfolds naturally, but let's take a look at how it unfolds over the course of the first 5 years. And as we said, there is a lot going on these first 5 years, a lot. So the course of development over the birth to 12-month period is the most important task for babies to develop is a secure attachment to their caregivers. And note that we will go into much greater detail in depth about the concept of attachment later on, because the quality of a child's attachment to her primary caregiver has such a significant effect on her long-term development. And you can see in these two beautiful pictures, the baby, that sort of eye-to-eye contact, that quiet, intense, just gazing into the mom's face. And then even at the bottom when the baby's yawning, I can't quite tell if the baby's yawning or crying, but again, it's that devotion and the pleasure in the facial expressions of the parents that really connotates that strong attachment. So starting from birth, babies are learning who they are by how they are treated. And through everyday interactions, parents and relatives and caregivers send babies messages like, "You're so smart, you're clever, you make me laugh, you're good at figuring things out, you are loved, I enjoy being with you." And these messages shape a baby's self-esteem. And these messages are not just delivered verbally or physically, but most importantly, they are delivered through your facial expressions, how you hold, how you talk in your tone of voice, but your facial expressions are critically important. In the first year, babies are developing an understanding or recognition of themselves as an individual in their environment, but also as separate from their caregivers. They begin to express a variety of emotions and share in emotional experiences with others. And some of the key milestones during this age range include the ability to read and respond to adults' cues and signals, to use simple gestures to start or reciprocate interactions, to seek and develop relationships with one particular adult, to express distress and other negative emotions when separated from primary caregivers, to demonstrate interest in others, and influence the reactions and behaviors of others. So the baby's brain has been developing for many months by the time she is born. So at birth, she is prepared to express some basic emotions, especially those that are associated with specific needs. So several emotion-related behavior brain structures that are already developed and active, such as the amygdala and other structures of the limbic system. The brain also matures during the first year in ways that prepare the baby for focused social interaction, such as attentional networks that enable the child to focus on a partner, and B, growth in the cerebellum, which increases control of movements of the head and arms that the baby will use when interacting with another person, and C, the development of the hippocampus, which contributes to recognition memory and the child's ability to differentiate between different social partners. So just unmute and give me some ways that you see babies in your care developing social emotional skills. Anybody? We'll take a couple of responses. Go ahead. What are some ways that you see?
When you talk to a baby and make sounds and they respond making the sound, trying to make the same sounds.
Great example. Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, it's Miss Billy. I'm getting ready to go into an infant classroom in a week here. I love when I walk into the room after like a bathroom break or something and I start talking and every head just turns to look at me.
Yes. Yeah, with excitement and anticipation. Hopefully, right? Yes. Yeah, that's great.
Well, they're just like, they're just like, oh, there she is. There's my person.
Yes, and that's great attachment and bonding and security taking place there. That's awesome. Anybody else have an example of how you see your babies developing socially and emotionally?
They learn how to, like the last point, influencing others. If they cry and we immediately begin to speak with them, they know that they're having an impact on the world around them.
Yes, and you're having an impact and they're learning that you are there to respond and meet their needs, which is so important in that social emotional development. Good example. Anybody else have one? Well, those were all good examples. And yeah, I'm so happy you're getting ready to go into your infant classroom in a week. And you're going to take all this information back and those babies are going to be delighted every single day to see your face and hear your voice and know they're in a safe space. And I just saw that when they know they're in a safe space, that's the beginning of social emotional development. And you can see that absolutely. Good answers, everybody. So next we're going to talk about social emotional development from 12 to 24 months. And young toddlers are starting to develop a growing awareness that they are separate and independent from others. This new knowledge helps them to understand that other people have thoughts and feelings that may be different from their own, and helps children begin to develop empathy. And that is the ability to recognize the emotions and the feelings of others, and to imagine how someone else is feeling and respond sensitively. And it's amazing to me as an infant mental health specialist and therapist for over 40 years, how I still see adults sometimes that have never developed a sense of empathy for another person. And I'm sure we all have. And when I think to myself, that was way back when. I mean, that should have been developing in this person between the ages of 12 and 24 months. And why do you think it didn't? Why would empathy not be there in a 35-year-old person or a 50-year-old person? Any ideas?
They weren't shown any?
They weren't shown any, absolutely. And often they were shown just the opposite of that. They weren't shown empathy, and they weren't taught empathy, to be empathetic to another person. And I think these are people who pretty much think the whole world revolves around them. They are very egocentric. And what a shame, because when you think about the opportunity that we had, that every single one of us had as a 12 to 24-month-old toddler, that this is when it started. This is when it should have started, and then should have just been reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. So make sure you're looking for that in your 12 to 24-month-old kiddos, and even older than that. But if it should be emerging between 12 and 24 months. And some of the ways that you can encourage this within the classroom is if someone does hurt another child, either physically or emotionally by saying something mean, you can ask them as the intervener in that situation. One of the parts of reparation that I'm going to talk about when we get into behavior is to say, how do you think Joey felt when you grabbed the car from him? And Joey can say how he felt. And how would you feel if Joey grabbed the car from you? Those are really important questions in the reparation of what goes on between teachers and children and their peers. And so we can help certainly develop the sense of empathy in our children and help reinforce it. And that is much more important than scolding them or giving them time out or some sort of, negative consequence, is to teach them. That's what discipline is, to teach. So we have a great opportunity to reinforce and to help them build empathy when they are so young. And you'll see examples of how the kiddos are being empathetic. And the more it's happening in your classroom with all of your kids, the stronger it's going to be in every single child. So sometimes making that something that happens out loud for all kids to see is not a bad thing to do at all. It helps them all to learn the ability to do that. And young toddlers are also becoming more and more interested in their peers, though at this age, their play is still more parallel or side by side than interactive. And children will begin to play more interactively with peers starting at 24 to 30 months. And we'll go into more depth on play in our next Friday's unit. So this growing awareness that they are separate from others also leads to behaviors that declare their independence, such as starting to protest. And what's their favorite word at 2? Anybody? Oh, come on, you know what it is. No. Yes. No. Right, exactly. And when they don't get their own way or they don't want to do something. And while challenging to caregivers, this is a very normal and important part of development and the sign of a child's growing sense of self. And this is what Erikson described in his ladder of social development as the separation individuation phase. And while it can be challenging, and it's those terrible twos, I say to parents, if you don't let them go through this period of time of separation and individuation, they're going to be living with you when they're 45, because they won't have known and had the experience of separating from you in this age of 2. And at what other stage of development do you see this happening? The terrible twos, and when else does it emerge? 12, I see 12. Yes. The beginning of puberty, teenage years. Yes, absolutely, positively, the teenage years. And they're just bigger toddlers, right? They're throwing bigger tantrums. But one of their favorite words is still no. It's just a little bit more expressive at that age. And the baby's brain is growing significantly during the second year. One of its achievements is easily apparent to parents, and that's growth in language skills due to the development of the language-related regions of the temporal lobe. Particularly, the increase in vocabulary from the first to the second birth and beyond. And children typically can say 1, maybe 2 words by the age of 12 months or so. But by the time they're 2, you can see how their language development has grown. And actually, there's some research studies that show that children that are in care during this period of this time in their age, their language skills actually develop faster because they're listening to their peers talk, and so that helps to enrich their language development as well. And growth in the interconnections between the different brain regions during this year may also contribute to the emergence of more complex emotions and the development of self-awareness. And that is such an important stage of development, is self-awareness. So during this 12 to 24-month-old period, children are gaining many new skills that support their social emotional development, including the ability to engage with others through complex back and forth interactions, to feel secure and to explore independently, begin taking turns with support from adult caregivers, recognize themselves in a mirror or a picture and refer to self by name, become more independent, move further away from the caregivers to explore, cooperate by helping to put things away, become angry if activities are interrupted or if they don't get their own way, respond to simple commands by an adult, begin to realize that they can't have everything their own way. This is a normal period of development when they hit, they bite, or they fight over a toy. They imitate adult behaviors in play. They show a complete range of emotional expressions, begin moving from parallel, that side by side, to more interactive play as they near 24 months old, and ask for what they want with gestures, sounds, and/or words. So what are some examples of how you see toddlers in your care developing social emotional skills? Anybody? Again, just unmute and respond, and then we'll move on. Anybody?
Come on, people, there's over 128 of you out there.
They're awfully quiet.
I just find that the parallel, or I mean the interactive play, comes a little bit later, after they're 2, between 2 and 3. They're still really, they might be playing in the same area, but they're not really doing that interactive play.
And that's a really good point, because we have to remember that, every child is different, and there are time frames where more typical development is emerging during these stages, but that does not mean that, that every child develops in that way. And they might be developing another skill faster, but one slower. But it's the overall picture of how we see this child as a whole child, that we pay attention to where they are developmentally, kind of what they should be on track for. Like if are they making some initiatives at more increased interactive play? And it might just take them a little bit longer to do that. The other thing I have found is that children that don't feel as secure are going to be slower in interactive play, because interactive play requires trust to a certain degree and security. And children who are more timid, or children who have had negative experiences and lack that sense of security and trust, are going to be a little bit slower to move into more interactive play. So that was a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else have a comment?
When a toddler is singing, when you're doing "Oh MacDonald Had a Farm," and they actually say the animal before you do, and they say what the animal is saying?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great example. Yes. Can't you just see those brain connections taking place when they do that? I just think it's wonderful. Good example. Anybody
Yes.
else have another one? Teresa says, I think it's awesome. Oh, I just lost it. I think it's awesome when a child is crying and another child helps them empathetically. Absolutely. Yeah. And you,
So my class that is moving on was this age, and some things that were really cute is when they play peekaboo, like one's by a shelf and the other one peeks around it, and they play a little game of peekaboo. I've also observed two toddlers sitting in a beanbag reading a book and passing it back and forth. That's so cute.
That is
And
so
just,
cute.
you know, sharing toys, passing it back and forth. It's really adorable to watch. But the beanbag book thing was just adorable.
That's a picture you need on your website.
Definitely.
Yes. Oh, and I just saw when children communicate basic needs in sign language. I love that because I really think we should, I hate shoulds, but I really would wish that all of us would teach our young children sign language. And we are using that at the Florida Center. I think I failed to say I was with the Florida Center for Early Childhood for 20 years. And I retired in September, although, Wendy, I'm not really sure what retirement is like, but I'm loving what I'm doing. And we are actually teaching our babies, and that's an inclusive program, just really like yours is, where we have a classroom full of children that some have some developmental delays and disorders, alongside typically developing children, and a great number of children who have experienced trauma and who do have behavior regulation problems. And our language delayed. So it was so fun to me when I would go into the baby room and see the babies not really signing to each other, but signing to the teachers when they wanted more food or they were all done. And some of these babies were like 6 months old. And I'm like, my gosh, that is just fascinating. I love it. And by the time I got to the 3-year-old classroom, they were actually doing a sign class, and there were 2 children that were different language learners in that classroom, and they didn't understand the other child's language, but they could communicate in sign. And it is a universal language, right? And so I think some of you might know we have a son that we adopted we got him when he was 4 months of age out of the NICU from Harlem Hospital, and he has fetal alcohol syndrome. And we said it was foster care only, and you know how that goes, right? And so he's 32 now, and he's ours, and he has come such a long way. But one of the things that really helped him in his early years, because he was delayed in every area of life, and language was incredibly delayed, and he was a major biter out of frustration and very poor impulse control, but learning sign language. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. He was biting in the classroom, and they were really working with him. And he had a one-on-one aide in preschool, so you know how intense it was. You'd have to fight to death to get that down here, I think, but I won't go there. But the very first, the speech and language teacher and his aide and the classroom teacher began to get some cues of when he was about to bite, and they taught him the sign, "Help me." And the first day he used that sign instead of biting, I'm gonna cry now. The program director called me and said he did it. He used the sign, he didn't bite. And it was like a miracle. So the importance of that sign language for our little kids with behavioral issues, I say even if they have language, it doesn't, and we're gonna learn more about this, it doesn't mean they can access language in times of stress. None of us can, actually. And I equate this to that, and this is in that fight, flight part of your brain, that flight, fight, and freeze, that reactive survival. That is a survival part of your brain that you can't control if you want to, if you feel you're under threat. And that's feel. You don't have to actually be under threat, but if your brain perceives you're under threat, it's going to kick in. And what do we often say to the kids? Use your words. They can't. Sometimes they cannot use their words. And it's like if you were going to be attacked in a parking lot by somebody who grabbed you from behind, you would not say, oh, excuse me, I think your behavior right now is very inappropriate and I don't like it. That's not what you would be doing. You would be kicking, screaming for your life, trying to run away. That fight, flight, freeze response would kick in, but you would not use your words to negotiate yourself out of that situation. And it's very much the very same way for our young kiddos. It's exactly the same way for our young kiddos. So, well, I'll get off my soapbox of teaching sign language, but I hope you all kind of consider that, and you might already be doing it. So that's a wonderful thing. And then when they sign to each other, I just love it. So we're going to talk about social emotional development from 24 to 36 months. They are growing their independence. They're understanding that they're fully separate human beings. Very wary now. They're children between, they have conflicts with their peers. You can also see a big increase in pretend play, often at this time, which shows that children are reaching a critical social, emotional, and cognitive milestone, and that's the development of symbolic thinking. They can now use their imaginations and develop their own ideas. They can pretend to build on language and thinking and social skills when children take on the roles and develop their own ideas and stories. And we'll discuss the development of symbolic play and the importance of pretend play when we talk more on our unit about play. They can begin to express their own thoughts and feelings separate from those of others, and their ability to communicate with words all mean that you may hear a lot of mine, no, or I do it. I love it when they say I do it. You begin to see more of that interactive play emerging, we hope, in encouraging that if it's not. And we also know that this is a time where conflicts are expected to be with their peers. They are still largely driven by their feelings and their desires, and they want what they want when they want it. They need support to learn to take turns and to tune into other people's feelings. Children develop more advanced social play skills such as sharing and turn taking without the support of adults between the ages of 3 and 5 years of age. And if you are not seeing that ability emerging, then we need to really help support them in that growth. Children between 2 and 3 years are driven by their emotions. They have difficulty with self-control, with waiting, with managing their emotions, because the part of their brain that helps children exert self-control is that prefrontal cortex, which is still the last, remember, it's the last part of the brain to develop. And the parts of the brain that process emotions, such as the limbic system, are more fully developed in children at this stage. This difference in areas of brain development are why we see children with little self-control and really big emotions. It's that prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that handles that planning and decision making, and it helps children think about and control their emotions, rationally weighing options and consequences. For example, a 2-year-old may still hit another child who grabs a toy from him, but at 3.5 or 4, a child is much more likely to start to raise his hand up, but then stop himself and instead shout, "Give it back." And this is what we see as the beginning of executive functioning, that ability to control that impulse and to use a different method to get what it is that they want. The prefrontal cortex is just beginning to develop and will over the next 20 years. So it's the last part of the brain, remember, to fully mature. And at 24 to 36 months old, this part of the brain cannot yet control strong impulses or emotions very well. which can lead to the types of behaviors that you find very most challenging in your classrooms. And as we explore and understand and manage challenging behaviors in bigger depth on Friday, we can refer back to this part. And also, this is a time for the ability for greater self-control is in the 3 to 5 year period. I think we covered all of those. So 3 to 5 years, their growth in their prefrontal cortex is taking place. Their executive functioning is becoming more elaborate. They are playing more collaboratively, but they still need to learn how to control their emotions. And their self-concept, or their awareness of how others see them, is developing rapidly. And this is something that I think is such an emerging and wonderful skill that we can see in our little ones at this age, because they are, and I love this slide, because they are becoming more aware and concerned about how their peers are feeling about them. And that is often a motivation for them to learn to change their behaviors, or they'll model their peers more that don't behave in this sort of meltdown way that they're behaving. And they can tell more complex stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they can also share ideas and negotiate some roles, such as who will be the waiter and who will be the customer. And at the same time, because the maturation of the prefrontal cortex still has a long way to go, it continues to develop for 20 years. Self-control is still very limited. So you can still see children in this age range of 3 to 5 having some meltdowns, having some challenges with their self-control, and still having you to be that bridge to what happens, or to help them merge from one part. I want to think of ourselves always as being that bridge from that bottom part of the brain to that higher level thinking brain. And as it can happen developmentally, fine, but we are there, I think, to be the scaffolders, to know what comes next. What's the next stage of development that I should be looking for in this child? And if it's not emerging on its own, or even if it is emerging on its own, how can I reinforce it all the time if it's emerging? Or if it's not emerging, how can I facilitate it? And that's that very important role that we have, that I sometimes say we serve as a bridge to help where these gaps in development are, or if they're slow. Preschoolers' self-concepts are also developing rapidly due to their growing independence and ability to do things for themselves, and their increasing ability to reflect and to reason. And they are very aware how others see them and are able to compare themselves to others. And I think at this point, it's 2:28. This is a good place to take our break. So we are going to take a 15, actually it's going to be a 17-minute break. And we are going to come back at 2:45. So please get up and move. You've been sitting for an hour and a half now, some of you.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, I have 2:44, so we'll give folks a few seconds to get back in. I see people arriving. That's a good sign. All right, I'm sure we'll have a few more folks drift back in. I hope that you all were able to take a real break in that 15 minutes and relax a little bit and hydrate yourselves and maybe get a couple of nibblies along the way. And I just want to explain that this curriculum was written really to be way before COVID, prior to COVID, and was years in development, 2 to 3 years, as I recall. And so it was written to be done in person with, you know, a lot of breakout activities for the groups to do together. And that, because of Zoom, is not possible. And especially condensing it from 21 hours to 6 hours. But typically, if this were in the 21-hour course, we would have some breakout rooms and some activities that you would be doing, but very different from how the original curriculum was written. But thank goodness we have Zoom and GoToMeeting, because we can still share this very important information with all of you, and not exactly the same context in which it was intended, but still, so, you know, we can still share that. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katrina, or whoever said that. I appreciate that. All right, we're going to move ahead, and we might actually wrap up a few minutes early today in anticipating how many slides to put in here. And taking them from different units, I wasn't quite sure. And we might not, we might go all the way till 4 o'clock, but whatever, it happens and we're all good. So we have one more, oh, every time I go out and in, this does not, there we go. We have one more slide to cover in our social and emotional development from 3 to 5 years. And that is that from 36 to 60 months old, children begin to solve more complex problems, play more complex games, certainly engage in more back and forth activity and language and play during this period of time, engage in more collaborative pretend play with others. They're able to describe their own feelings and their wants in a more meaningful way. They can respond to others' emotional needs. And this is just such a great slide of it's probably a bigger brother helping a younger sister with her emotions by being next to her and putting his arm around her and comforting her. And this is what we should be doing in seeing in children 3 to 5 years old. They are able to exhibit greater impulse control. They're able to use their words to express their complex feelings and thoughts. They are beginning to be able to regulate their attention and sustain their attention for longer periods of time. They are able to regulate their thoughts more and their feelings with less support from an adult. So let's just hear a couple of examples of what you see in your children 3 to 5 years of age that that you can see that they're developing appropriate social emotional skills during this time frame. Anybody just unmute and state and then remute?
They're starting to express how they're feeling by using words or using the pictures that we have in the classroom.
Great. Yes, I'm so happy to hear that you have pictures in your classroom too. It's one of the things that we really have to teach children, and we do have to teach this to them, are facial expressions, because they can only see yours. They often can't see their own, and they can't identify feelings easily. So teaching them, you know, just even the basic mad, sad, happy, and scared. Those are usually the 4 feelings we start with in mental health to identify. And then being able to express those either by pointing to the picture or using the words. That's a great example. Anybody have another one? Do you see them playing more together?
As I've
Yes.
observed some preschool classrooms, what I enjoy seeing is the children, you know, they are playing more cooperatively, but they're making plans together. they're making a plan and carrying it out, especially like in the blocks or any kind of a manipulative if they're working together. And that just that back and forth conversation and problem solving as they go along, that's really nice to see.
That's a great example, Wendy. And I'm so glad you said that, because one of the things I had intended to say is that I love the high scope curriculum. And that was the curriculum that was used in Seth's preschool in Albany, New York, 20 years ago. And I didn't know the curriculum before he was using it at school. And then I learned about it. And it was one of the most important cognitive beginnings for him. And it's that plan, do, review. I don't know if it's still the same process, but back then, and for him, it was plan, do, review. And if you think about that, that word plan is an executive functioning skill. And because that's the last part of our brain that develops, we don't often hear the word plan or know how to make a plan until we're much older. But if you can make a plan, you can really begin to self-regulate. And having a plan, we all need our plans, right? If I didn't have my plan, I don't know what I'd do. Seth still relies on plan. It is still a very important word in his vocabulary. And when he's building a project, which he's incredibly, amazingly skillful at with Legos and just about anything, I say to him, how did you do that? And he said, well, Mom, it was really pretty simple. I made a plan. I did the plan, and then I looked at the plan to see if it worked. And if it didn't, I went back and made changes. Like, duh, Mom, really. And so I love that. I love to hear that they're making plans, and I love that you're teaching that at such a young age, because it, like I said, you can't see people think, right? You can't see people think, and yet we want them to think. And so even like bringing out those words, like, what do you think we should do next? Or do you have an idea about what we should do next? That is really helping to elaborate on that cognitive process of thinking and planning and doing and reviewing, which is such an important, that's also a sequence. And sequencing is critically important for kids to be able to do, because it puts things in order. And they do begin to see a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like they do in stories. They can see that in the play that they're doing with another child, or just how they're going about the course of their day. And it also gives them predictability. And predictability gives security. And one of the first ladders of Maslow's hierarchy is safety and security. And if we don't feel safe and secure in our environment, there is no way we're going to reach those higher cognitive concepts of learning and behavior and high skill levels. So the more we can be, and we have no idea what predictability they have at home, if any, and maybe their predictability is that something, they're going to be hit any moment, or that something terrible is going to happen. And so that puts their brains in that what state? Fight, flight, freeze. And if they're in that state, they can't learn. Nobody can. You can't, I can't. If I'm in that state, regardless of our ages or who we are or our degrees or whatever, if we're in fight, flight, freeze, we cannot learn anything. One of the things, I would go into our classrooms at the Florida Center and often see some of our little ones that just seem to be in fight, flight, freeze 50% of the day, and having major challenges with their peers and with their teachers and with themselves even. And so just however you can reinforce that sense of predictability and planning, you're reinforcing safety and security. And as I think we said in the beginning, all of these developments, the cognitive development, the social emotional development, even the physical development, is not independent of one another. They are so interactive and dependent on one another. And so we can't just focus on their cognitive development, because they're so much more than their cognitive development. And we need to work with the whole child, and keeping that in mind, that with every activity, how am I helping their cognitive development, their social emotional development, their physical development? How am I doing that? How is this activity reinforcing all of those skills in each of those different areas of development? So yes, thank you for that wonderful example, Wendy. So we're going to watch a movie now, hopefully. This is the first time I've actually taught through GoToMeeting, but I think things are working. And so we're just going to keep saying that things are working. I usually use Zoom, and this is a little bit different, but we're going to see if we can get this video to play. Oh, maybe not. Okay, go back up. Let's try that again.
Meet Jeff and Karen, parents of Jessica.
Can you hear it?
They have big dreams for her. Like most parents, they want her to be confident, kind, and well-behaved. They also want her to be a good daughter, a loyal friend, and a successful student. They have been nurturing these critical qualities since Jessica was a tiny baby. In the loving way they respond to her, read her cues, and make her feel loved and important through their everyday interactions. Starting from birth, babies learn about themselves by how they are treated. Through daily interactions, parents, relatives, and caregivers send babies messages like, "You're clever," "You're capable," "You're loved," "I enjoy being with you." These everyday moments provide many opportunities for nurturing children's positive sense of themselves and strengthening the parent-child bond. Reading and responding sensitively to babies' cues lets them know that they can trust another person will be there when needed to keep them safe and meet their needs. This is the foundation for healthy social emotional development. Another way you nurture healthy social emotional development is by being there for your baby, staying calm and comforting him when he is fussy, which is a normal part of the first year. This is the way babies learn to trust. Over time, the experience of being cared for and soothed helps young children learn to soothe themselves, a vital skill called self-regulation. Establishing routines for bedtimes and mealtimes contributes to this. Babies feel safe and secure when they know what to expect. As children enter the second year, they become more aware that they are separate beings with their own thoughts and feelings. As a result, they begin to assert their independence, an important social emotional milestone. For example, they may venture further out to explore. When you encourage your toddler's efforts, even if it takes more time and patience, you are nurturing her confidence. During the second year, children are beginning the process of managing their strong feelings. You help your child by offering acceptable ways to express emotions, like ripping newspaper, stomping their feet, or throwing a foam ball or some other vigorous physical activity. Learning to express feelings in appropriate ways is the first early step towards self-control. During the second year, toddlers are also becoming more interested in their peers, though they mostly play near them, not with them. Nurture these early social skills by modeling turn-taking and sharing. Between ages 2 and 3, interactive play with friends starts taking off. This provides toddlers with lots of practice learning to share, resolve conflicts, and experience the joy of friendship. 2-year-olds are also becoming more and more aware that other people have their own thoughts and feelings, which leads to the development of empathy. Empathy is the ability to imagine how someone else is feeling. a critical skill for building relationships throughout life. How do you nurture empathy? By showing empathy. For example, comforting your child when he is upset. You can also point out how others are feeling, like explaining that a boy is crying because he scraped his knee. Older toddlers are also becoming better able to express and recognize feelings. You help with this skill by naming the emotions they experience and see others expressing. You matter. The ingredients for building a strong foundation of social and emotional skills in the first 3 years are trust, consistency, and loving interactions, all experiences you provide. Your caring responses help your child develop self-confidence, establish friendships, and begin developing self-control. When it comes to raising a loving, confident child, remember that you make the difference.
Okay, we're going to pause there for just a second and process a little bit. I think that's a wonderful video. 0 to 3 has done just such an amazing job putting this, as I said, this whole curriculum, and they've got some fantastic videos that we'll be seeing again on Friday. So again, just unmute yourself and make a comment, and then mute yourself again. What are some of the skills that you saw the children using in the video? Anybody? Anybody see any skills that the kids were using in the video?
The boys in the kitchen were working together.
Yes, absolutely. Cooperation, right? A joint play, yes. Good. Other skills you saw the kids using? There are actually a lot of skills the kids were using in that video at different stages. All the ones that we've really talked about that are critical for development. And what did you see the parents, how did you see the parents really supporting these skills in their children? What were the parents doing? Building relationships. Say that again.
They were comforting them.
Lots of comforting going on, right? Lots of comforting going on. So when that kind of comforting and attentive comforting is taking place, what's happening in that child?
They're creating good self-esteem.
Yes. They are creating good self-esteem because they're being paid attention to and they're being loved and they're being comforted. Yes. Great.
They're growing brain connections.
Absolutely. Their growing brain is growing. And I see a comment that the parents were very nurturing, and they really, truly were very nurturing. And so all of that nurturing, remember we talked about this being a period of time of opportunity, but also vulnerability. So in this film, in this short video, did you see opportunity or vulnerability?
Opportunity.
Opportunity, absolutely, positively. And the baby is not aware enough to take lots of opportunity, yes. To take advantage of all those opportunities, it really has to come from the parent, the caregiver, to see those opportunities, to create those opportunities, and to take advantage of those opportunities. And it's really a dance between the adult and the caregiver and the baby or the child. And the more that we can get those connections going, remember, the healthier the baby's going to be. And there were a lot of supportive ways that the parents were interacting with their children. Watching them, taking their cues sometimes, letting them lead in the play. Those are all just amazing and wonderful things that the parents were doing to help really help their children's social emotional development. So we're going to move on. And what we did know is that the developing brain is affected by children's experiences and interactions with the important people in their lives. I'm just going to go back up there for a second. I guess I'm not. That brain development in turn helps to shape how we feel about ourselves, how we interact with the world around us, and how we form meaningful relationships with others. Social emotional development and brain development are linked, with one influencing the other. And this relationship between social, emotional, and brain development underscores the critical role that parents and providers play in the long-term health and well-being of the children in their care. And it's not just emotional well-being. We know now from the study that was done called the ACEs study that the amount of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, a child has, the more it is going to affect their emotional, their mental, and their physical health as they become adults. And so really trying to create those safe environments where children are not being traumatized or incurring trauma is really, really important for how they're going to grow up as individuals. And remember, they do as they've seen, they do as they hear, and they do as they are being done to. So in some of our homes, we can't necessarily control what's happening within those homes and the degree of trauma the kids might be exposed to, but we certainly can in our child care centers. So, you know, really being a trauma-informed center and really looking at these kiddos in the sense of probably many of them have suffered some forms of trauma, maybe have more than one ACE in their basket already, and they're only 3 or 4, you know, years of age. And I say the more challenging the child is in their behavior, the more likely they are to have suffered from more than one trauma, or they're constantly in a trauma world and they're just defending themselves the best way that they know how. So really thinking about that, and that you're really, and I'll say this again on Friday, the most important intervention, and I know we're always looking for interventions. Well, what can I do when he's doing this? Or, you know, what do I do when he's doing this? The most important intervention in the child's life is you. You. It's not some activity or some strategy necessarily, it's you. And just remember that if you are there and you are being there for them and responding in a nurturing, sensitive way, and not looking at that child, as we say in the world of trauma informed, not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you. It takes a whole completely different reframe on how you see that child and experience that child, how that child might trigger your own buttons, how that child might trigger your own past traumas. That's also can happen. So just being aware of that and keeping that in mind. Now we're going to take a look at some specific parts of the brain. I love this hand model, and I don't know who actually was the creator of this, but this is how, and you can teach the children this. They love this activity. So we're going to begin by solidifying our understanding of the 3 regions of the brain that are involved in social emotional development. And so we're going to do that by making our own 3-dimensional model of the brain with our hands. So raise your hand. That's how you start. It doesn't matter if it's your right hand or your left hand. Hold up your open hand. Now fold your thumb into the middle of your palm You can see me doing that. Curl your fingers over the top of your thumb and flip your wrist down. And now you've created a pretty handy dandy model of the brain. The forehead of the person is in front of the knuckles, and the back of the forehead is toward the back of your hand. Your wrist actually represents the spinal cord rising from your backbone upon which the brain sits, remember? And if you lift up your fingers to raise your thumb, you'll see the inner brain stem represented in your palm. And place your thumb back down and you'll see the approximate location of an important group of structures called the limbic system. And this makes a symmetric model. And now curl your fingers back over the top. And this is the very front part of your brain. Your cerebral cortex is now in place. So great job of creating your own three-dimensional model of the brain. And we'll continue to talk about these parts of the brain and the way that they play a role in social emotional development. So we're going to now look at experience shape, the structure and the functioning of the brain. So we've talked about this before just a little while ago, that while the science suggests that most of our brain cells called neurons are present at birth, the connections between these neurons are still developing and multiplying at a very rapid fire pace, more than 1 million neural connections per second in the first 3 years of life. And that is a really pretty overwhelming number when you think about it. I can't even think about that high of a number, but that's every second in the first 3 years of life. And while many of these connections are genetically determined, they are also influenced by early experiences. And remember, I'm going to say experiences, and relationships. And we'll talk a lot more on Friday about the quality of relationships and the quality of attachment and how relevant it is to how these children's brains are developing and growing and connecting, and what neurons fall off and what don't. And while many of these connections are genetically determined, they are also influenced by early experiences. And these experiences can be provided by parents, by caregivers, by providers, by friends, by community members, by extended family members, often grandparents, who can play a very important role in the life of the child. In other words, brain connections are experience dependent, and that is that the connections happen only if the child is receiving the environmental stimuli that is needed to build them. And if you participated in part of Unit 1 that we covered today, we've covered neurons and how they make connections and how they are influenced by children's experiences in the whole world. So we're going to look at baby Tanika here. And this is a picture of baby Tanika, who is being lovingly held and read to by her daddy. And during this experience, her brain is forming connections relevant to and activated by this positive interaction. As Tanika's daddy continues to create loving and nurturing and enriching experiences for her, associated brain connections are growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And this experience is building brain circuitry that lays the groundwork for healthy social, emotional, cognitive, and language development. And over time, Tanika's love of language and the well-being associated with her daddy become what we call hardwired together. That becomes a part of permanent architecture of her developing brain, which is so amazing when you think about it. And the story of baby Tanika illustrates the lasting imprint that early connections have on the developing brain. Remember that positive experiences lead to strong neural connections across multiple regions of the brain, including the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the brainstem. And just as much as negative experience leads to brains that are wired to expect danger, which can lead to children having challenges in many areas of functioning, including children with social emotional development. And children whose brains are wired to expect danger tend to be more reactive and have a harder time controlling their impulses, which makes developing healthy relationships much more challenging throughout their lives. They also come to expect that relationships are harmful and so are more guarded and less available to get close to others. So let's just take a moment and think about some of the kids in your classrooms. And what would give you a cue that perhaps they are living in an environment where they expect danger? What might you see them do?
Maybe kind of reserved, quiet, sitting off, maybe not interact as much with us.
Startle easily. I saw. Can you repeat that? Because the voice, the voice was a little muffled.
I would say maybe they're a little shy, reserved, maybe not interact as much.
Yes, you might see them as very shy, very reserved, not interactive much. And if you had to say they were in the fight, or freeze mode, which one of those three modes would that be?
Freeze?
Yes, absolutely, positively. They're going within within themselves. And that's a freeze reaction when they do that. And I saw some other wonderful examples that were mentioned. They can cry, hide. Hide is one of the big things that they do. They'll withdraw. Yes, they'll hide. They might hide under the table. They might hide in a cubby. And which one of the three flight responses would that be? Would that be flight, fight, or freeze? Flight, absolutely. So I want you to pay attention when you are with your kiddos next time. Look for those fight, flight, and freeze responses. Fight's pretty easy to see. And the fight can be verbal, where they're screaming at you or they're screaming at another child, or it can indeed be physical, where they are becoming physically reactive. Recognize that as a flight response, as a fight response. And then those flight responses are, yes, hiding, putting things over their heads like their blankets, withdrawing from the crowd and trying to, just get away. And then those freeze are just, I'm not engaging, I'm not moving. It's almost like they've stopped functioning completely. They just shut down because that's where they are in that freeze zone. And yes, I saw more reactive, much more hypervigilant. These are kids that if somebody comes in the room that they are not expecting, they can kind of startle, but then what might they do next?
Try to get their attention.
They might try to get their attention just so they have more predictability and control over what's happening, but what else might they do?
Seek a familiar adult.
They're going to run to you. They're going to, and children who don't want to leave your side, who don't get into that separation, individuation, who don't explore but cling to you and don't want to be far away from you, those are kiddos that you can suspect they are hypervigilant. And there's a reason for that. And usually the underlying reason for that is some sort of trauma has occurred. Or if somebody new comes in the room, they don't know. And that can even be another teacher. If they don't know them and they don't know if they're a safe person or a not safe person, they can react in one of those three ways of fight, flight, or freeze. They can run to you as their safe person to protect themselves, to feel safe and to know that you will protect them. So pay attention to, don't pay attention to their behaviors as bad, but pay attention to the behaviors as a form of communication. This is the only way sometimes they have to communicate with you. They don't have the sophisticated language to express sometimes their feelings or their thoughts, or even to tell them what might be going on at home because they're too afraid to do that. So pay attention to their cues. What are they telling you? What are they trying to communicate to you through what it is that they are doing? I often say when I am training that I believe all of us in this field have a primary role, and that is being a detective sometimes. And we're trying to figure out why children are doing what they are doing. Our job isn't to just extinguish the behavior, which is often what I think we've been trained to do. Just get rid of the behavior. That's all I want. Just get rid of the behavior. But that's not our job. Our job is to help them self-regulate. Not to regulate them, but to help them self-regulate, to learn how to self-regulate. And we are the bridges of their self-regulation. And we have to see ourselves as that they're struggling. They're struggling, and there's a reason why they're struggling. And they're going to need a lot more support and a lot more nurturance and a lot more understanding and a lot more of that P word that's really hard when children are acting out, and that's patience. And sometimes that's hard. And that's why, I'm so excited that Children First is really initiating this model that we're going to move to, that's putting the infant mental health consultants and specialists in the rooms to be a support to you too. They're there to help support in the children's development as much as possible, but they're there to help you too, and to be supportive to you, because your jobs are really hard in having to negotiate these battles every day, and you have a lot of kiddos, and we don't know what kind of home environments they're coming from, but we can expect that many of them are not positive. And so please, call upon your consultants if you're having a challenge or a difficulty, or your own triggers are getting and buttons are getting pushed by this kid, and they're not there to judge or to tell you what to do. They're there to facilitate with you, to walk it through with you, to think out loud with you, to role play with you if that's something that would be helpful. And I used role playing a lot when I was learning how to be a social worker. I would be like, well, I need to see how you would do that. So they're there as your helpers and your facilitators. And so you have one of the, I think you're the only program in town, except the Florida Center, who now has infant mental health specialist as a part of your program. And I could get on a long-winded political soapbox here, but I'll try my very best not to. But I believe the biggest mistake we're making in education right now is not providing mental health consultants in every single preschool in this community. And I have been working on a team to try to make that happen. We now have them in every single elementary school in Sarasota, thanks to the school board. And those are therapists from the Florida Center that are in those classrooms. And what a world of difference it is making. And I think it's now in its third year. But behavior referrals have gone down. Relationships between teachers and children have become enormously positive instead of negative. And the whole school culture has changed from that trauma and from that seeing that trauma-informed lens in a different kind of way, seeing the kids differently, and not reacting just by punishing or suspending or expelling, but by working and facilitating and working some more and letting the children know that they care, no matter what they do. And that's not condoning their behaviors, But no matter what they do, you are there to support them emotionally. And then you need your own support and your own self-care taking. So make sure that in all of this that's taking place, you're taking care of yourself. And I know you have some tight teams there that support one another and rely on one another. And that is a really, really wonderful thing. And that you've got your own staff wellness committee, which is fantastic. And so take advantage of all of your wellness opportunities, because if you are not well mentally and physically, they won't be well either. And again, it's a huge responsibility, but it's a wonderful opportunity. So our last slide for the day, and then I'm going to stop the share and we're just going to have a discussion. I probably could have put a little bit more in here, but now I know how many to include. And this last slide, oops, sorry about that, is about plasticity. And we talked about that a little earlier. But the brain's ability to organize and reorganize itself based on an individual's experience is called neuroplasticity, which we already said. And although plasticity continues over the course of a lifetime, the brain is most adaptable and shaped by experiences in the early years. And this means that early childhood is a period of both opportunity, if the child's experiences and interactions are positive, and vulnerability, if the child's experiences and interactions are negative. It is important to note that if a child's brain does not get off to the healthiest start, it does not mean that all is lost. However, the longer children have been exposed to negative experiences, the harder it is and the longer it takes to get that brain circuitry to become reorganized when exposed to new experiences. The implications for us as providers are clear then, that the relationships we build with the children in our care play a critical role in how their brains develop, affecting children into the long term. And what we do and how we do with the children in our care matters tremendously. So it is only 3:30, but I'm going to get out of screen share, hopefully, let's see, and come back to our full group. And I don't know if it's possible for you guys to get your cameras on so I can see all of your beautiful faces. And we'll just have a chat about what we've learned about today and what part of this do you want to take back and focus on the most with your kiddos. And you can't do everything all at once. That's the other thing. It can be overwhelming when you think about all of this and how much is involved and how those brains are wiring and rewiring every single minute of every single day. But if you take one thing from today and say, I really want to think more about this, I want to learn more about this, I want to go practice more about this with my kiddos, tell me what that one thing would be. And you can just unmute and share and remute. And I can't see your names or I would call on you. But if somebody can just start the conversation, and then if you have a friend on here whose face is on here, when after you do it, just call on them. Who's going to be our brave starter? What one thing have you learned today that you want to learn more about, that you want to get better at practicing?
When I'm working with the older children, ways to encourage them to plan activities, to think about who's going to do what, and to make those kind of decisions.
Great. And you're teaching them all kinds of skill in doing that, right?
Yes.
Absolutely, positively, yes. Good example, thank you for that. Do you see a teammate on here you want to call on next? Anybody want to go next? Go ahead.
I would say I mostly see administrators, so.
Oh, okay. All right.
Ms. Bond, would you like to answer that?
Did she say no? You don't have to. You don't have to answer. Anybody else want to share?
I think for the older kids, as I have the older ones too, I think it's getting them to work on how to calm themselves down first before we can talk about what's going on, because you're going to get nowhere if you can't calm them down. They're going to get more aggravated.
Absolutely a great point, because if they're upset, remember their brain can't think. It shuts down. They're in one of that fight, flight, or freeze modes. And until they can get calm, they can't think. It's just like us. We can't think when we're not calm either. And one of the things that, and Seth, as I said, had major self-regulation issues when he was in preschool and for a while after that. But one of the we made a card for him that was a very, very simple 4-step process. It was stop with a stop sign, think with a finger to a brain or a light bulb, I can't remember now, plan, and that's your critical word that you all have. Let's stop ourselves right now. I can see you're very, very upset. We're going to, the first thing we have to do is get ourselves calm. And you help get them calm by doing what? How can you help calm them?
I can answer that one.
Okay.
By being calm yourself.
Amen, sister. By being calm yourself. If you get all aroused and wacko, is that going to help them get calm? No, it's going to do just the opposite. If they see you getting stressed and aroused and you're the old adult, you can't, they're not going to see you as a helper. And I see Billy just posted breathe. Yes. One of the things that we know about the brain in that parasympathetic nervous system, that is the calmer, remember, of the brain, the calming part of the brain. One of the things that we know through brain research that absolutely positively works is deep breathing. And you get them to slow their, because they're usually their hearts are in a rapid speed at this point in time. If they're so upset, they're breathing from a shallow place. So they're not even getting in enough oxygen. And that cycle kind of perpetuates itself. The longer they stay in it, the harder it is to get them out of it. So deep breathing from their bellies, like deep breath in. I'm going to do it with you, Joey. Let's take a deep breath in and hold it and blow it out. Just think about a balloon. And you all need to do this for yourselves too, in your classrooms, because you could be modeling for them how to do this deep breathing. And I mean, we all need to do it when we're stressed and even when we're not, because it helps our parasympathetic nervous system keep us calm, not just get to calm, but to keep us calm. So what's another thing you can do? Yes, the balloon technique from conscious discipline, absolutely, positively, yes. Any other thoughts about how you can calm them?
I have, I don't know if you can see it, but I have this ball and I have them, take a deep breath and then blow it out. And they get to physically move the ball when they are breathing, so they can kind of feel how it is outside their body, if that makes sense.
What a great idea. I love that.
So or you can $8 ball at Amazon. So
you got that at Amazon?
Yeah, $8.
I love Amazon. That Amazon Prime truck is in front of my house every day. My husband says, what happened if it doesn't show up? Like, I don't know. That's a great example. And then, and when they are breathing and they are doing things to help them calm, it's really important to reinforce that and say, I love how you just calmed yourself down right now. Because what is that teaching?
It's encouraging self-regulation.
Absolutely, positively. It's encouraging self-regulation. And you've empowered them to say, I can do this by myself. My teacher at some point may not have to help me. I've learned the tools to calm myself. And so you've taken that from that external you to placing it in them internally, which is self-regulation, not outsider regulation. Does that make sense? So everything that they begin to do to calm themselves, we need to reinforce that for them and not take it for granted, because it's hard work on their part. It's very hard work. So, and sometimes just sitting close to them. Some children like for you to put an arm around them and some do not. Some get very reactive and pull away from that. And is that a cue to you that they have maybe not had good experience with touch? Yes. And that they're being reactive to touch. So, you know, respect their space, respect that if they don't want to be held or touched, that's okay. Some kiddos love to curl up in what we call the calm blanket. And to have I don't know if you can have blankets in your room yet with COVID, but having a safe space in your room they can go to where they can feel safe and help themselves to calm. And one of the other things that we have in our classrooms, because sensory toys, sensory fidget, sensory items can be very soothing and calming. And for some of our most behaviorally challenged children, they all have their own individual calm box. It's got their name on it. They get to decorate it. It's like a shoebox. And inside that, they can select 5 things that they want to put in their calm box. And it gives, what they select can be cues to you about what their sensory system is in need of. And so in that, we might have a squeeze ball. And what I love are the squeeze balls that look like brains, which you can also get from Amazon, because it's also then you're showing and teaching them about their brains. And that's tactile, but it's also proprioceptive, which is another sense that most of us don't know about, but that's our muscles and our joints getting input, which immediately calms the nervous system. You might have something oral. If you've got a kid who constantly chews on their shirts when they're anxious, you might have some straws in there for them to chew on. Kids who bite, the best thing to have is a dog chew toy, because they can bite that, redirect them to that instead of your arm. And then one of the things that Seth loved, because he's very visual, are those sort of like timers where the water flows down and it's just so peaceful looking at it. And you can actually get those. And I just go through the dollar store and grab different items for calm boxes. But knowing that every child who needs one has one, and that maybe there's one in the classroom that's open to all kids, then you are helping them. Popsicle sticks is another great way to express anger, and it is proprioceptive. So if they're hitting or throwing or breaking things, you can say to them, that is not okay, but you can break this popsicle stick instead. And they love that. Sensory bottles, I see that, I love that, yes. And they're all kind, I mean, you can just get all kinds of sensory items on Amazon and on a lot of the sensory processing websites. They've got a lot of sensory gadgets and sensory toys. When I was doing this class last week, one teacher, and these are teachers from all around Florida, one of them said that they've got 3-pound like weighted little blankets in the room that children can wrap up in. And that weight is really, really, that's a proprioceptive method, and proprioceptive input is the one biggest thing that helps kids calm down the fastest. And that can come through a number of different things. And I'm sure you all have your own sensory thoughts and ideas. The other person that I think should be in many of our preschools are occupational therapists, because so many of our kids have, I think, sensory processing issues. Maybe not enough to get a diagnosis, but they certainly have that. And sensory processing issues are a huge contributor to poor self-regulation, to behavioral outbursts. And so the more that should we ever do brushing? Well, I would say yes, but you should probably be taught how to brush by an OT, or if you've been taught already, that's probably a procedural thing for your administrators. But Seth was brushed every 2 hours at home and school when he was in school. That's proprioceptive input. and has a very, very quick impact on the brain in terms of calming down. So yes, when you're in your teams or you're meeting with your teams, have them think about the calm boxes, because they really serve so many different kinds of needs, and they build a relationship with you, a relationship of trust, and that they are seeing you as someone who cares about how they're feeling, not just how they're behaving, but how they're feeling, and that you are there to help them feel better and to think better. Because guess what? If they feel better and they're thinking better, what's going to happen to their behavior? Anybody?
They'll be comfortable and better.
They're going to be comfortable. Yes. They're going to be calmer. They're going to behave better. Yes. It's just, that's the formula. You know, good feelings plus good thoughts equals good behavior. It's a pretty simple formula. So yes, but we work on feelings, we work on their thoughts, we work on our relationships with them, we work on their positive experiences, and then the rest the brain kind of takes care of the rest of it, and all becomes well. So I'm wondering if you have, it's about a quarter till, oh my goodness, I just chattered on there for a long time. Any questions from today that you would like an answer to? Any concerns that you heard? Anything you'd like to see done differently on Friday? I think we have several more videos on Friday. But anything you'd like to see differently done? Anybody?
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
When we're talking about calming and what in decades past, we would rely a lot on music and singing to help calm upset children. And I don't see that talked about much anymore. What is the thought about that?
Well, my thought about that is that music is the center of the brain for many people. It's part of a right brain activity, but it also crosses to the left hemisphere. So it's global. It's also universal. So I really love having music in the classrooms, especially during times of transition. And that can be in the morning when children arrive, having some, and classical music has been shown to be the most effective in calming children. But also stimulating their brains when they need to do work or learn. So having the role of music and movement is vital. Yes, it is. And sometimes when we get so focused on cognition, and I hate to see this happening in kindergartens, they've almost eliminated music and movement. And that is what those kiddos still need in kindergarten. They need it in every grade. But absolutely, positively, music is rhythmic. It teaches familiarity again, predictability. There's so many different skills in listening to music, even playing instruments. So I am a strong advocate of that. And music was one of the ways that Seth learned. And you can take a left brain concept and any kind of a left brain concept, and if you put it to music, and that can be hard for kiddos to get and understand, but if you put that concept into music, they will learn it so much faster. It's amazing. So yes, I'm a huge proponent and movement. They need to move their little bodies. Great question. Anybody else have a question, concern? Family is that I make, oh, the big joke in my family is that I make a song for everything. I love it, Katrina. I make a song for everything. That's great. Well, you know, at 2 o'clock in the morning one time, yes, patterns are better learned with music rhythm, absolutely. In the midst of our difficulties with Seth, I think he was about 2.5 years old. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up, and one of the rare times I guess he was asleep, and I wrote a song to the tune of Row, Row, Row Your Boat. It's amazing how creative you can be when you have to be. And it was stop, think, use your words when you're feeling mad. Ask your teacher for some help, and then we'll all feel glad. He got it immediately. I can't sing, but thank you. He got it immediately. If I had said, I want you to learn these words, stop, think, stop, calm, use your word, it would have never, ever, ever worked. But when I put it into music, and he loved music, he got it immediately. He sang it at school. And it's been years since I've used this with him. But if I asked him right now today, 32 years later, if he remembers it, I guarantee you he could sing it word for word, because it's in there. So yes, use your music, use your movements, put everything you're doing into singing. You could have a show at the end of the year. We could do a musical. All right, my dear friends, I think it's 3:45. I'm going to let you go about 15 minutes early today, but don't count on that on Friday, even though it will be Friday and you'll be tired. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this day with you. What a great group. I can't believe there was 127 people on here at one point in time. So I thank you so much.